there is a debate out there. Maybe it's here a little bit too, but not so much here. But there's a debate out there about what people are calling a guy named like Jonathan Chait over at the New Yorker. He's calling the democracy movement in New York Magazine. The democracy movement. Some people refer to it as the resistance, although the resistance is a pretty blanket term. And there is some soul searching now from the center to the left as to why is it the left, and that being sort of the, and I don't know where to define this, but the sort of more Bernie sympathetic. I don't want to do it in these terms because it's just that litigates something I don't want to litigate. But those people in the left of the Democratic Party, through DSA, those types are cynical about the resistance. And in Chait's reading of it, it is because they hate democracy.
This usual subtlety.
I was going to say, like, it's almost like it's just.
You know what the problem with Jonathan Chait is? Is it the same reason among many, but he's actually, especially for such a centrist, he's pretty good at writing about the right, but he applies his same, like the same blunt instrument that you need to understand the right, he applies to the left, which is an inaccurate way of reading the left.
Right.
Not to mention, some research just came out that the people who actually hate democracy the most are the center and the far right.
Yes. I mean, despite the fact that there's a bit of a straw man here, his piece is why Trump's assault on democracy doesn't bother the radical left. And he says the rise of Donald Trump has galvanized what could be called a democracy movement in the United States. Liberals, and he said, now this is, on the ground, there's not a big difference. But in the intellectual level, things look very different. Liberals compose the right flank, and leftists or socialists, the more progressive wing. In short period of time, Marxists and other radical ideas have gained a great deal of currency among the progressive intelligentsia, and their critique of the democracy movement shows how the very meaning of democracy is bitterly contested within the left. Well, first off, what I love is this notion of dubbing it the democracy movement. I hadn't heard that, right? I mean, that's like, this is a completely made up thing, and he's deciding to call that. And I would suggest that, if it really is a democracy movement, and this is part of the reason why, there is cynicism about this. If this is a democracy movement, then someone should tell Mark Warner. Then someone should tell Joe Manchin. Then someone should tell Chuck Schumer. Because they are cooperating far too much with this administration if we are still in the mode of, hey, we're going to lose our democracy here. That's a real problem. If you're going to argue that there is an existential threat to our democracy, you better be more concerned about the leadership of the Democratic Party that is not taking your warning seriously. The reason Trump concerns democracy scholars is that he violates norms or threatens to. A norm is simply a common practice, as distinct from formal law or regulation. Before last year, FBI directors served 10-year terms, and Trump switched them. While left-wing critics of the democracy movement have no sympathy for Trump, they do not share this analysis of the threat he poses. To begin with, these critics see the threat posed by Trump as his policy agenda, not any damage to the American system of government. Now, look, there's two different things here, and there's a little bit of sleight of hand. I'm quite sure that those of us who see Trump's policy agenda as highly problematic also see his incredible corruption as being highly problematic.
And that the two are synchronized.
Well,
That's where the argument starts.
That's where the
I
argument
understand. That's where,
starts.
but I don't see how you can see that.
And then he goes on to say, liberals see the Constitution as a flawed document that contained high ideals and have, in fits and starts over 2 centuries, come closer in alignment with reality. Leftists regard it as a bitter joke, barely worth of defense, worthy of defense.
That's what we call
Partly
it in our Slack documents, our Slack group. We're like, that bitter joke democracy.
Bitter joke.
Did you
of
like
the
that Limbaugh
Constitution.
sound?
It's like a rubber chicken in document form.
And then he uses, and I think really misuses, Aziz Rana, who's been on the show twice in the past couple months.
Very interesting target for extreme, acerbic, non-rational thinking about democracy. It's an interesting
honestly,
one.
He's one of the guests that we have. Like, look, we get a little bit dry, but he, and his stuff was not dry. It's very interesting, but it was a pretty sober analysis, I would say. But he says, Rana, right after saying leftists regarded as a bitter joke, barely worth of defense. Look, I can't tell you how many centrists I know who think that there's deep-seated problems with the Constitution, not the least of which, the number of representatives that we have, the way that the Senate works, the way the Supreme Court justices work. I mean, deeply feel it's deeply flawed.
From like a very operational and procedural viewpoint that would reflect their centrist politics.
So very strange the way that that he's mutating. He's really, really working hard here. Rana dismisses defenses of, quote, Constitution and country, end quote, and the belief that, quote, the founding principles, end quote, contain, quote, a basic commitment to universal equality, end quote, as homilies that politicians had to repeat to be taken seriously by party gatekeepers and thus rise to prominence. In truth, Rana asserts American capitalism is, and quotes, inherently oppressive. Now, if I'm reading his assessment of Rana here correctly, it is Rana thinks that people cite the Constitution rather cynically, and that the founding principles and whatnot, to the extent that people cite them, were clearly hypocritical at the time, right? I mean, I think we can all agree that not everybody was created equal at the beginning of this country. I mean, even
I don't know what you could possibly be talking about.
Even if you
maybe
think
you should
it's
be a little bit more respectful of norms.
And then he goes, having dismissed American democracy as a myth, left-wing critics seem to have missed some of the finer points of its continued functioning. Now, look, you got guys like Martin Gillens who have written about that money drives our politics, that when there's any contested questions in Congress, that the side that is promoted by big money wins. I mean, these are
I think the top
uncontroversial.
line is like since the 60s, right? There hasn't been a major policy dispute.
I don't know if it went back. I don't think he
Well,
went back
for
to
a
the
while.
60s, but it's been for at least decades. And I mean, this is poorly written, but it does.
It has a lot of term paper language in it. I remember like
There's a lot of big
when
jumpy
you're
jumps.
writing and you're like, oh my god, how much more can I extend the word limit on this?
But
And
Eric
you're like they rather the
Eric Levitz sort of works off of that piece and makes something interesting of it. In fact, I'm going to interview him for Ring of Fire this week. But he says that America's version of capitalism is incompatible with democracy. And this is America's version of capitalism. And he says, look, if you're going to argue that the problem with Trump is that he's breaking the norms, then when Chuck Schumer takes over as the leader of the Senate, you better want him to seat Donald Trump's justices. You better want him, right, to hold hearings forthwith for that next candidate, as opposed to saying like, hey, remember what happened with Garland, right? Because if the idea is to reinstitute norms, if that is the ultimate objective here, that policy changes have nothing to do with it, that's what you better be prepared to sign on for. And if so, that's pretty pathetic. He writes that in Chait, in terms of the democracy movement, sees all the telltale signs of a bad case of norm erosion. Thus, to heal our republic and immunize it against future strains of the same virus, several liberal thinkers have called for the formation of bipartisan coalitions in defense of democratic norms and rule of law. In their view, the threat Trump poses is so grave and unique. Ideologues on both sides of the aisle should now prioritize maintaining rule-based order over winning policy battles so as to safeguard their freedom to settle such disputes democratically in the future. And he goes on to say, however, several social democratic and or democratic socialist thinkers see state and federal legislatures who routinely slash taxes on the wealthy and services for the poor in defiance of their constituent wishes. Regulatory agencies that serve as training grounds for the firms they're meant to police, a Supreme Court that's forever expanding the rights of corporations and restricting those of organized labor, a criminal justice system that won't prosecute bankers for laundering drug money, but will dole out life sentences to small-time crack dealers, a central bank that has the resources to bail out financial firms, but not the homeowners whom they exploit, a Pentagon that can wage multi-trillion-dollar wars that exacerbate the very problems they were supposed to solve and still get rewarded with a higher budget, even as the housing department asks working poor to pay higher rent for worse accommodations. And seething beneath all those defects, disparities in the distribution of private wealth so vast and consequential, the nation's super rich have come to enjoy an average life expectancy 15 years longer than its poor. That's the point. Is Donald Trump something so unique, or is he a natural product of these policies that have disenfranchised so many people? Now, I happen to believe that the vast majority of Donald Trump's support is based in racial animus. And I do think that there is some reason to believe that some of those people are also expressing their racial animus as a result of a general frustration and malaise they're feeling because their wages have been stagnant, or they're living in an area that's depressed, or they're not seeing any benefit, and it's just easier for them to find a target with, the brown people or the libtards or whatever. That very well may be the case. But what is indisputable is that these are realities. And even if you want to take away as to whether or not you want to take away the efficacy of these as political issues, they are clearly problems in our society. That's undeniable. All of those litany of things that were just listed, those are undeniable facts that are taking place and are also very threatening to our democracy. Because the way a democracy falls apart, right, is that things become such within the functioning of society that enough people are either turned to right-wing populism or are just feeling like nothing's ever going to change, so why should I show up to vote? You talk about Wisconsin, you talk about Michigan. There was a lot of voter suppression too, but there also should have been a lot more enthusiasm to come out and vote. But a lot of people just feel like this is not going to help me.
Which is fair.
Look, without even judging it, who cares if it's fair or not? If you can't get people out to the polls, that's not just the people's problem. It is the problem of the politicians. And that is the reality of it. It's like we can't snap our fingers and make 100,000 people do something that we individually think is the right thing for them to do. The whole point of politics is to convince people that something is the right thing to do, and then get them to do it. And
that's on you, right?
That's just the bottom line.
Right.
It's just like I can't change the weather either. I can complain that it's raining, but I can't change the weather. People are as people are. And if they're disconnected from politics in such a way that they don't think it makes a difference whether or not Donald Trump is president, they don't think it makes a difference as whether or not he's telling the truth, then there's something else that is problematic. And if you get into politics, your job number one is to fix that. That's the point of being in politics. That's the point of going into government. And so the idea that somehow radical leftists or whatever, whatever that means. I mean, because if you're referring to these people as radical leftists, then I'm not sure that you.
I guess. I guess I owe the Bernie-crats an apology, really, for making it easier to red bait the whole group of them.
I mean, it's well, I don't think he needed much.
I did like Aziz Rana's PhD dissertation. Democracy totally sucks, man. It's a lie, dude.
I mean,
she published for the Princeton Review.
And look, here's the bottom line: we are looking across in these special elections. We see these Democratic primaries, things like Medicare for All. Axios is reporting was a big winner. Now, I guess we're going to find out in the general election if they carry the day or not. But there's no reason to believe that they won't. These are very popular policies. And it remains to be seen, frankly. And I haven't seen anybody prove that, making it about like what Jennifer Palmieri called for a month after Donald Trump was elected. No ideology, no agenda, just about how horrible Trump is to various groups in America. Just, is rude to, doesn't like. I mean, I think, frankly, if you were to really dig into the perspective, let's say, for instance, in the African American community, I think they would say, yes, Donald Trump is horrible racist. But we've had racists for a long time, and systemically, we have some problems that are bigger than Donald Trump. Donald Trump going away is not going to solve the racist problem. In fact, Donald Trump is there because, on some level, of the racist problem. And I think that cuts across all of it.
Yeah, I don't think there's that many mainstream politicians who don't have something racially problematic about them. You got to judge people. I mean, certainly there are degrees, but given the choice between like a Trump and, I don't know, a Bernie who maybe doesn't reach out as effectively as he should or could, I think the choice is pretty clear.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm saying is that it's not even a function of an individual. It's a function of we have systemic problems, and
ironically, it's a whole other way of breaking down this debate. For all of Chait's talk about norms and procedure, it's all like if your politics is just defined with your personal discomfort that this guy is president.
Well, it's not just personal. He would say it's a threat to democracy.
I get it.
I think there is.
There is, but at the same, another thing that I like that Eric Levitz pointed out in that piece was he was like, you know what? Maybe when Robert Mueller is put in jail on terrorism charges, the calculus flips, and this procedure and democracy movement stuff being first and foremost, maybe then that runs to the head of the deck. But certainly I was going from him to the Jennifer Palmieri quote. I think those types of statements really just reflect a personal repulsion to him, which is fine, but they're almost, they can't be systemic because they're almost like allergic to that type of analysis because everything's just a kind of signifier.
Look, you would have to believe, and listen, I certainly subscribe to the idea that James Comey, but for that James Comey letter, Hillary Clinton probably wins. I would say maybe but for a certain amount of voter suppression, Hillary Clinton probably wins. Then I will go on with the litany of but fors in terms of her campaign and whatnot. But you have to reckon with the idea, and we would have had to have reckoned with it even if she had won, Michigan by 10,000 votes, Wisconsin by 5,000 votes, pulled out somewhere else, Pennsylvania, by 5,000 votes. You'd still have to reckon with, how did Donald Trump, this total scumbag, who represents just about everything that we can say in a broad sense is bad about America.
And humanity.
How did he?
I mean, really
and
broad.
humanity. But how did he get so close? Like, I think you would have to reckon with that. You'd have to say, like, we've got a problem here. We defeated cancer, but it could come back. Like, maybe we need to change the way that we eat. Maybe we need to go, less red meat. Maybe we need to get more exercise. Whatever it is, like, you need to address those things. And I don't know. This is an argument you're going to see over the next couple of months because there's going to be an extended argument as to how Democrats should be running in these general elections. Once the primaries are over, then people are going to fight for what the issue sets are that the Democrats are going to run for. And if they take over the House, then people are going to fight for what those issue sets are. And this talk of norms and democracy movement, this is just no labels dressed up in a different way. When Chuck Schumer refuses to show up at the Senate, when we don't have Democrats defecting and agreeing on rolling back Dodd-Frank, this is what I would say to the Jonathan Chaits of the world. Get your own house in order. There are no radical leftists who are running in the leadership of the Senate. And so why aren't they as concerned about the threats to democracy that you seem to think that the radical left is not? Right? I mean, that's the real question here. Not whether or not you can bring aboard, Aziz Rana from his powerful position. The question is, where's Chuck Schumer?
Chuck Schumer's like, yeah, I actually just read Aziz Rana, and my feeling is screw democracy.
Honestly,
Well,
Yeah.
where are the
it's total
completely
nonsense.
mainstream? Where are the people on the? I mean,
Well,
if you want to
where-
put this up as an ideological thing, where are the people? Where's Joe Manchin? He doesn't love the Constitution.
No. Where's by the way? I mean, what's his? I guess.
Well, Heidi Heitkamp, what
Heidi
is she doing?
Heitkamp.
Is she going to like? She's taking
Why didn't every single Jonathan Chait
ayahuasca
column
and going on a vision quest and
That is a
talking
very,
about
very,
some
very
type of community.
interesting
Like, what's
concept.
going on here?
He's bending over backwards to avoid making the connection between our democracy being in trouble and capitalism and the shift to neoliberal capitalism in particular.
Well, you know what's really
happened over the past
Without
What's
a doubt.
actually really
decades. And like
ironic is,
it is ironic because the left, it's not that we don't care about democracy. We think the problem started before 2016 because it did. And if you want to talk about norms, this neoliberal system, it arose fairly recently. If we want to return to norms, talk about the New Deal, talk about like this is just regular progressive Democrat stuff. This is not even leftism.
I would say democracy totally lame is the new tag for my show. But I think that it's ironic too because people like Glenn Greenwald or Marcy Wheeler, they actually have a far better case to make that they are the minders of constitutional and procedural process when they focus on things like the NSA or the surveillance state. Like if Jonathan Chait was so purely concerned about it, all of his recent columns should have been on making sure that Gina Haspel wasn't confirmed as head of the CIA, which dovetails exactly what you're saying about who to hold accountable in the Senate leadership.